very happy to be here and to have been invited by Larry to play a small part in this discussion. This is an updated version of a presentation that I gave at St. Agnes Parish a couple of months ago, just the day after the Supreme Court decision. So the issues raised by that decision are still with us today, and I've had a little bit more time to reflect on it. So as Larry mentioned, I work for L'Arche Canada, and he also mentioned I'm the outreach and communications person for L'Arche Canada, so I'm unable to resist the temptation to talk a little bit about L'Arche and to tell you what it is. I know many in the room tonight would have heard of L'Arche, that it was founded in 1964 by a fairly well-known Canadian, Jean Vanier, son of former Governor General and Pauline Vanier. But I like to tell the story of L'Arche not as one that began 50 years ago, but that began 100 years ago. It began, in my view, with this gentleman and his wife Pauline. This is Governor General Georges Vanier, who in 1914 was an up-and-coming lawyer working in Montreal. And of course, 1914 was a difficult year for the world. He made the decision in that year to give up his law practice and to serve his country as a soldier. And he became one of the founding members of the Royal 22nd Regiment, the Vendus, out of Quebec. And with many other Canadian regiments, they trained, and then in 1915 went over to Europe, and he ended up fighting his way through Europe. It's interesting to read his memoirs from the time. He had a journal that he kept when he was in the trenches of World War I. And of course, at a certain point, he gets to that place where he's asking the big question, why am I here? Why am I in this hell on earth, so far from my home? And what am I doing this for? And his conclusion is very telling. He says, I'm not doing this for Canada, or for Quebec, or for France, or for Belgium. I am doing this for human rights. I'm doing this for humanity, is the conclusion that he comes to. Very, very powerful. You see there in his reflection the large vision that in a way he would pass on to his children and to his son Jean in particular. Georges wrote that the road of unity is the road of love, and that we should always be striving for unity in dedication to the common good. So switch ahead from 1914, a big decision, to the son 50 years later, almost to the month. In 1964, Jean Vanier makes a decision to leave his life as a professor at the University of Toronto, and prior to that he, as many of you know, had also been a naval officer. He was a naval officer at the age of 13, joined the British Navy. One of the key moments in his life, he describes going to his father and telling him that he wanted to join the Navy and go overseas. And of course, the North Atlantic, 1942, not the first place many people would have chosen to be. And yet his father says 3 words to him. He says, I trust you. And that, the trust of Georges for Jean, Jean describes it as having opened up a whole world for him, and it's a pivotal moment in his life. So he joins the Navy, he travels, he sees the world, he pursues his studies, he becomes a doctor of philosophy, he teaches for a little while at the University of Toronto. But all the while, he is a man of faith, and he was listening very closely to the inner voice of God within. And that voice was telling him he needed to follow the gospel. And so he very simply, in 1964, invites two gentlemen from a local institution. At the time, of course, people with disabilities were quite marginalized, kept away, out of sight, out of mind, on the margins of society. And he invites two gentlemen out of an institution to come and to live with him in his house. And that there began L'Arche, the organization that I now work for, and have been part of in one way or another for about 30 years. L'Arche is, I can't go on too much about it, but I'll give you a few kernels of what we're about. At L'Arche, people with and without intellectual disabilities live and work and pray together as much as possible like a family. And as recognizing that everyone has gifts to offer, everyone, regardless of their abilities or their capacity physically or mentally, or otherwise, everyone has something to contribute. And that a society, in order to truly realize its potential, can only do that in recognizing that everyone has something to offer. Everyone is believed to have the capacity to grow and to mature into adulthood and to make a contribution. And the important goals of achieving personal growth and maturing socially as an adult are things that are understood to be nurtured most effectively within the context of a community. I think Larry spoke very eloquently about this thrust in society today toward individualism. At L'Arche, we're trying to go in the opposite direction, recognizing yes, people need to grow as individuals. And yes, everyone, regardless of their ability, needs to have a place to belong and to make a contribution. But we need to do that in community. We need to do that interdependently. So independence is not the goal. Interdependence is the goal. A little quote, it says, "Can we reasonably have a dream of a world where people, whatever their abilities, can find a place and reveal their gifts?" That maybe sums up what L'Arche is about. Here's another quote, a biblical quote. "I do not call you servants any longer," says Jesus in the Gospel of John, "because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I've heard from my Father." Friendship at L'Arche is the fundamental relationship. And insofar as we build friendships, we build a better and a more compassionate society. So I want to share with you now just a little about our experience in L'Arche creating these communities that I referred to, where people of differing abilities and differing fragilities come together, and where we learn about life with one another. And this part of my reflection is designed to help you understand why L'Arche takes a particular position on this issue of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. "It is always the most fragile among us," says Jean Vanier, "who are the closest to their humanity, to their suffering, and to their need to be loved. It is they who show the rest of us the way to live in truth and in love." And of course, the reality of life and the beauty of life is that we all begin as helpless, vulnerable little children, little babies. How much do we learn from the most vulnerable, the most fragile? And we go through, life is a process of growing toward strength and toward competency and toward the development of our gifts and our talents and our skills, our relationships. And we all kind of are on that arc. Again, regardless of what gift or abilities God has given us, we're all on an arc of growing and realizing the potential of those gifts and abilities. And then life takes another turn, and we move toward increasing vulnerability, increasing fragility. And that's a beautiful reality of life. And it's something not to be feared, but to be embraced. But again, to embrace it outside of the context of a community, of a family, is asking a lot. We need community, we need family in order to embrace fragility and vulnerability. Over the years, we've been very privileged, and I've been privileged personally at L'Arche to be able to accompany many of our members on their final journey home, both those with intellectual disabilities and their assistants, long-term assistants, some people who have lived in L'Arche communities for decades. Jon Vanier himself right now, this is his 50th year living in a L'Arche home in France, so and that's where he'll die, he says. And I'm always struck during these times in community how mature and how beautifully real some of our most fragile and vulnerable members are, especially at these moments where we're accompanying people in their final days. It's staggering. We talk about growing toward maturity, and oftentimes, when I'll go and I'll visit, like here in Halifax, we had one of our original founding people with disabilities died last year, maybe about a year and a half ago now. So she was with us for a short time. L'Arche in Halifax has only been in existence for 4 years, but she came to us at the beginning, and then she died just over 60 years old. And just being in the room there with her, both at her house, L'Arche House, and then at the hospital, and seeing the way that some of the people with disabilities treated her, and how maturely they responded to her, and just being there with her. Whereas many of us more capable, educated people were a little more awkward, didn't quite know how to deal with the situation, There are many stories, but one I like to recount is the story of Paul, who's a young person with disabilities in his 20s who lived at L'Arche in Toronto and who died just a few years ago. In addition to having an intellectual disability, he had strokes every few months. He would have a little stroke and become less and less able. And he contracted AIDS in the middle of it all. He had a transfusion. And so he really suffered a lot. And despite his many afflictions, when death was near, he adopted this incredible presence. And you wondered when you were in the room with him, who was doing more for for whom, right? I'm here to console you and to help you. No, this is amazing. So one day, one of the assistants in his home was sitting at his bedside, and she asked him if he was okay. Okay, he responded, as if he didn't quite understand her question. Then he looked at her intently and he asked, "Do you love me?" The question startled her, but she replied, "Of course, Paul, I love you," explaining that the care that she was giving him was in fact a sign of her love. And then he asked her, "Does God love me?" And of course, there's only one answer to that question. So she answered, "Yes, Paul, God loves you very much." "Well, if you love me, and if God loves me," said Paul, "then I'm definitely okay." And he died a couple of days later. It's about accompanying people. Jon Vanier says, the deepest question in the heart of every human being isn't necessarily, do you love me? But who's going to be there for me? Especially when I can no longer be there for myself. That is the deepest question. Who will be there for me when I can no longer be there for myself? Another person that Jon knew quite well and who used to engage him in discussions, or she was building communities in the streets of New York City. Jon was building this little fragile community northeast of Paris. She said, "We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community." At L'Arche, we're very committed to palliative care. And when we are faced with having to make decisions with people around end-of-life care, the palliative option is the option that we pursue. And we pursue it with very dedicated doctors and nurses. It's incredible the people that surround our little L'Arche communities in Antigonish and Cape Breton and Wolfville and Halifax and St. John and beyond. Incredibly dedicated doctors and nurses and specialists who are as committed as we are to trying to be there for people in their final days, and to make sure that their lives are lives of quality in their final days. The scary thing, knowing what it often takes to ensure proper palliative care, is that there are many people in Canada and many people with disabilities in Canada who obviously don't have the kinds of supports that organizations like L'Arche are able to provide. And it's these people for whom we are most concerned in this whole discussion around doctor-assisted suicide. And now that the door has been opened. So I just put that up there as it's the cover page of the Supreme Court decision. It's very interesting, I've had, numerous occasions to talk with Jon. I've driven him around when he visited Nova Scotia. He visited here quite often back in the early 2000s and late 90s, gave retreats and spoke at the Dartmouth Sportsplex and up in Cape Breton and St. FX and places. And he's not someone who speaks out publicly on political matters often, if at all. This is one issue in which he has chosen to speak out publicly. So that in and of itself makes me pay attention. Why is it that Jon has spoken out on this? The philosophy I think that Jon operates by, and it's one that sums up largely what we're about in L'Arche, is it's usually better to propose than to oppose, to demonstrate by your actions what it is you believe and what you're committed to. But there are times when you do have to take a stand as well. And we believe this is one of those times. Last year, the Physicians Alliance Against Euthanasia and Vivre dans la Dignité in Quebec invited Jon to say some words on a little video that they produced in an effort to influence the discussion in Quebec around Bill C-52, the bill promoting assisted suicide. And so there is there's a short film, you can find it online, where Jon lays out his reasons for opposing this. And he's there with Dr. Balfour Mount, who's one of the founders of palliative care. So why has Jon spoken out so strongly? I mean, it's summed up. It's his belief that with the legalization of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, those who are most vulnerable are put at risk, to put it as simply as I can. And he even says in the film, we must avoid at all costs legislation aimed at killing people, ultimately legalizing euthanasia. In a world where the weak and the vulnerable already experience numerous challenges in finding their place, The recent Supreme Court decision is another sign that society is gradually abandoning its commitment to the things that help to secure a safe place for everyone. L'Arche is not alone in its opposition to this. The Council of Canadians with Disabilities and CACL came out very strongly and were better prepared than L'Arche was in terms of issuing a public statement on this, and you can find what they have to say online as well. I'll just draw one quote from their statement. They say, "As we each near the end of our lives, at a time when we are likely to be most vulnerable to despair and to fear, we have now lost the protection of the Criminal Code of Canada." That basically sums it up. So we've lost legal protection, and Larry spoke very eloquently about the implications of that. So how are we responding? By recommitting ourselves to providing the best possible supports for people with disabilities, both in life and in times when they are facing death. We believe that the time spent walking with people in their final days should be more about helping them to live as fully as possible than about helping them to determine how to engage others in the process of assisted suicide. Some key questions we've identified. The Supreme Court of Canada decision will require the Government of Canada now to spend huge amounts of time and energy and resources on facilitating and regulating practices around doctor-assisted suicide. And of course, the goal of all of this is to mitigate the possibility of abuse and error. That's the language used in the Supreme Court decision. So a huge amount of effort and time is going to go into that. Shouldn't governments and all who have a vested interest in creating a more compassionate Canadian society be doing more instead to ensure quality end-of-life support for people, rather than the kind of quick solution, apparent solution? What really is our commitment to one another, not only in life, but in those times when we have to help one another to face death? Are we truly confident that the legalization of doctor-assisted suicide in Canada is going to make life better for people, especially for the weakest and most vulnerable who often lack societal and family supports? Wouldn't our time and energy be better spent working to expand home care services and supports for community independent living? I was just talking to a gentleman at the break. There's a lot of people trying to do this, but we need as much help as we can get within government, within the bureaucracies of government, at the political levels, and amongst organizations partnering in the way that Larry and I are partnering tonight. Two organizations that, have their own focuses most of the time, but here we're brought together with on a common cause. Most importantly, wouldn't our time and energy be better spent working to ensure that access to palliative care becomes a universally available health care service to provide needed support and choice at the end of life? That is our ultimate goal. I mean, we are really committed. We think that palliative care is the best response, increasing and making it a universally available health care service. That is our goal, to advocate for that. So the solution, and I've just named four: to educate people on the issue, drawing attention to what people like Jean Vanier and Balfour Mount and the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and the CACL and many good groups. Not Dead Yet, that was the group you mentioned? People First. There's all sorts of really good groups. non-governmental groups as well out there who are trying to make a difference and trying to advocate for the things I'm talking about tonight. We need to recommit ourselves to providing the best possible supports for people with disabilities. I've said that already, both in life and in times when they're facing death, expanding home care services, and working to ensure that palliative care becomes a universally available health care service. Just a couple of other quick things. So this is a website developed by L'Arche a couple of years ago, but we're constantly updating it. It's aginganddisability.org. It exists in French as well, but it's a place online that we've put a lot of time and energy into sharing resources, primarily focused on people with intellectual disabilities, but it can be broader than that as well. There's some very good grief support materials, some very good information about palliative care, about what you can do in the event that you have a family member who's in need of end-of-life care. So aging and disability, it's a little clumsy and long for a web address, but aging and disability, if you just Google it, the L'Arche site will come up. So as I said, lots of practical tools to face the challenge of aging with grace and with dignity. Healthy aging, changing needs, complex palliative care, ending life well, and grieving. I'll end just with the quote from before. It's always the most fragile among us who are closest to their humanity, to their suffering, to their need to be loved. It's they who show the rest of us the way to live in truth and in love. All we have to do is to pay attention. Thank you.